History as it happens, August 25th, 2022. The Espionage Act.
The FBI is investigating Trump for potential violations of the Espionage Act.
That's just one of the bombshells contained in the federal search warrant for top-secret documents
that have been altered, destroyed, or concealed.
They found 11 sets of classified documents, secret, top secret, and some beyond top secret, a category called SCI.
The FBI's search of Donald Trump's resort does not mean the feds believe the former president actually engaged in espionage. In fact, the law is rarely used to prosecute spies. Its origins are connected to the climate of repression and xenophobia as the United States entered the First World War, a time when the government trampled civil liberties in the name of national security. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
No, I don't think Mr. Snowden was a patriot. I called for a thorough review of our surveillance operations before Mr. Snowden made these leaks.
There's no real clear definition of what constitutes, quote, information about national defense. You could imagine, that covers an awful lot. Just as in 1917, what it means to, quote, interfere with the war effort is equally vague.
On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed at Sing Sing prison in the electric chair. That was a little more than 3 years after Julius was arrested under the Espionage Act for passing top-secret information about the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. They were the only Americans to be convicted and executed for spying during peacetime. The Rosenbergs' case was a sensation. Americans followed it in newspapers and in newsreels that sounded more like government propaganda during the anti-communist hysteria of the 1950s.
Someone had passed America's atomic bomb secrets to Russia. This was an undisputed fact that the whole world knew. The federal government had laid the crime at the doorstep of two native New Yorkers, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
Rosenberg's wife is also accused of complicity in the plot against the country's security.
Inside the stone walls of Sing Sing prison, the Rosenbergs wait all day for word of their fate. It's now more than 2 years since they were first
While appeals to the highest courts are planned, it certainly appears that the spies are headed along a one-way street.
The Rosenbergs always maintained their innocence, but today most historians, aided by documentation made available by the collapse of the USSR, agree that they were in fact spies, although there's always been more doubt about Ethel's role in her husband's activities. It's been more than a century since Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917, and the Rosenberg case is probably the most famous one prosecuted under that law. Another famous case unfolded in the 1990s.
The burning questions in Washington: how could it have taken so long? So long to arrest the highest-ranking CIA officer ever accused of selling out to the Russians? Aldrich Ames and his wife Maria are still, of course, the...
Before investigators finally nailed Aldrich Ames in 1994, he had sold secrets to the KGB for a decade. He spilled the name of every U.S. agent operating in the Soviet Union, leading to the executions of 10 CIA agents by Soviet authorities. Ames was sentenced to life, and they probably did throw away the key. But despite its name, the Espionage Act has rarely been used to prosecute spies, the sensational cases notwithstanding.
And I think that knowing its full history is important, and sort of accounting for the fact that it got on the books in a hurry. It has tended to be reformed and expanded during periods of political crisis. Say, for example, in 1950, in the midst of the Cold War, the Korean War, the threat of atomic espionage. Historian
Christopher Capozzola is an expert on citizenship, war, and the military in modern America. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. The Obama administration used the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers like Edward Snowden.
So the fact is that Mr. Snowden's been charged with 3 felonies. If, in fact, he believes that what he did was right, then like every American citizen, he can come here, appear before the court with a lawyer, and make his case. If the concern was that somehow this was the only way to get this information out to the public, I signed an executive order well before Mr. Snowden leaked this information that provided whistleblower protection to the intelligence community for the first time.
As the president tried to explain, it is illegal to retain or disclose without authorization information related to national defense that could harm the United States or aid its enemies. Of course, people disagree over what constitutes such harm or aid. I, for one, am grateful for what Snowden did. He exposed the government system of mass surveillance. But if he were to return to the United States, he probably would be convicted under the Espionage Act. In the case of Donald Trump, well, he's the only former president to be investigated under the Espionage Act. But as of now, as I speak into this microphone here in late August, we don't know exactly what was in the documents he kept at Mar-a-Lago or why he had them. The information released so far is light on details. So rather than speculating about Trump, we're going to look at the Espionage Act's sordid origins. When you heard the news about Donald Trump, did you know the Espionage Act dates to 1917? Were you aware of its strange history? Because at the start, the law was used and abused to crack down on dissent, on unpopular opinions, as we might say today. The Wilson administration ran roughshod over civil liberties. Socialists were a frequent target because of their anti-war activism and antipathy toward capitalism. On June 16, 1918, days after U.S. Marines went into action against the Germans in the Battle of Belleau Wood, socialist Eugene V. Debs delivered a searing speech in Canton, Ohio. Here is part of it. And here let me emphasize the fact, and it cannot be repeated too often, that the working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish the corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war and they alone make peace. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die. That is their motto, and we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation. If war is right, let it be declared by the people, said Debs. You who have your lives to lose, you certainly above all others have the right to decide the momentous issue of war or peace. For those words, Debs was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. According to the letter of the law, he attempted to cause and incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, and refusal of duty in the military and naval forces of the United States. In other words, Debs tried to convince Americans to resist the draft. Without conscription, the U.S. could not fight the war. The government cracked down on speech and snared socialists, communists, immigrants, newspapers, magazines, early filmmakers. It was so ugly an episode in the American story that the historian David M. Kennedy concluded in his book, Over Here, the First World War in American Society. In the pre-war years, progressives had held in productive equilibrium the ancient tension between the political ideals of self-government on the one hand and efficient government on the other. Faith in man's reason and reliance on the techniques of education and publicity had sustained that equilibrium. But the war had cast dark clouds of doubt over that faith and had shown the perverse effects that could result from abuse of those techniques. Kennedy goes on to write, one of the casualties of the war for the American mind thus seemed to have been the progressive soul, and the spiritual bloodletting very nearly drained the last reserves of utopianism from American social thought. The next reforming generation would hearken not to the buoyant optimism of John Dewey, but to the sober voice of Reinhold Niebuhr, preaching in Augustinian accents the doctrine of human imperfection and the necessity of diminished hopes. The war had killed something precious and perhaps irretrievable in the hearts of thinking men and women, and that is David M. Kennedy. Christopher Capozzola is a historian at MIT and the author of Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen. Chris Capozzola, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the history of the Espionage Act, what brought you to the subject, other than the obvious answer that you're a historian and you're interested in this period of American history?
The First World War often gets, a line or two in people's high school textbooks, but in fact, it's a crucial turning point in U.S. history, in the history of the federal government, and also a window into what American society is really like in a moment of tension and crisis.
It's not a pretty chapter.
No, I mean, this was a very divisive war. Not all Americans agreed that we should enter it, that it was in our country's interest. Many felt that entering the First World War would be a real departure from previous American traditions by sending American troops abroad. So, it was really as divisive as some of the more politically conflicted wars of the 20th century.
And maybe some of us would like to think that kind of repression wouldn't happen in a country with a First Amendment.
Well, you would think that. And, there certainly was repression of anti-war speech and ideas. And you would think that that would be a violation of the First Amendment's protections for freedom of speech and expression. But in the early 20th century, what exactly the First Amendment protected and who it protected you from was really still an open question.
Perfect lead in. The reason why I asked that question is to get to the political culture, the milieu of the early 20th century and what grew out of that, largely as a result of the crackdown on free expression. Our modern jurisprudence about free speech has not been around since 1789. So let's begin by discussing the social environment in 1917. As you discuss in your book, there had been this ongoing debate about free speech. What kinds of speech should be allowed? What kind should be punished and by whom? There had been free speech champions for generations, but no institutional networks that connected them. For instance, no ACLU, right? Until the repression of World War I served as a catalyst. So why don't we start there? What was going on in the country in 1917?
The best way to think about that is what is it that people were talking about and what kind of ideas were out there that someone might have an interest in suppressing. And at the turn of the 20th century, that would have been very much about not only the First World War, but in the generation before that, questions like labor and their rights to organize, questions of ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and viewpoints around things like women's suffrage that would have been contentious. And that would have been hard to get a hearing for in what Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes would later call the marketplace of ideas. There were, not necessarily federal laws regulating or suppressing speech before World War I. And so in that sense, the First Amendment was not really tested before the First World War. You have to remember at this time, the Supreme Court believes that the First Amendment applies only to the federal government, not necessarily to states. And states were, of course, repressing controversial speech left, right, and center. But at the federal level, the First Amendment had hardly been heard before the Supreme Court at all.
So we'll get into why Wilson and his administration wanted to federalize it. But first, what was this tension between free speech and something that was called responsible speech?
If we look back at the political culture of a century ago, we find that people were as likely to talk about their political obligations, their duties, their responsibilities, as they were about their rights and their liberties. The two went side by side, two sides of the same coin. And what we would call a civil liberties revolution, the rights revolution that defines our political culture in the 21st century, had not really happened yet. Right? And so as people are thinking about what it means to be a good citizen, they feel that includes being responsible in your speech, that you shouldn't say something that would endanger the government, and that responsible speech was seen as something that was an individual obligation alongside individuals' rights for free expression or publicity.
Speech that endangers the government. The definition of endangering the government. While calling the President of the United States an SOB for getting us into this war, well, maybe the authorities would think you're endangering the war effort with that type of comment, right?
Yes, and there were examples of exactly what you're talking about. Often sort of late-night barroom talk could land someone under investigation by the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to what is now the FBI.
I think what's disturbing about this period is how many Americans were willing to denounce their fellow countrymen.
Yeah, I was really shocked by that when I was doing research. You would come across letters where people would turn in their neighbors, their coworkers, sometimes even members of their own family. And I think that's because In part, the federal government had empowered them to do so through federal propaganda encouraging Americans to keep an eye on their fellow citizens, and in particular their fellow non-citizens, including their German immigrant neighbors. But also a sense that people had that without a really strong federal enforcement mechanism, that responsibility for policing speech landed in the individual's own sort of backyard. And that really opened up the possibilities for real repression and overzealousness.
Well, we do have our own denouncing culture these days. It's called Twitter. So
yes.
Hopefully no one comes to arrest you, though, if somebody makes fun of you on that platform. Anyway, 1917, Congress, with a lot of debate, passes the Espionage Act, which was, well, it sounds like it was designed to stop spying and espionage, but it had a lot of provisions, right? It was an omnibus bill.
The Espionage Act, it has the title of Espionage Act, and some of its provisions deal specifically with espionage, with the transfer of materials to foreign agents, with the presence of foreign agents on, for example, U.S. military installations. But it includes multiple provisions that were drawn from a bunch of different places. In part, the United States is looking at what the other warring powers in Europe are doing. Britain has something called the Defense of the Realm Act. They're also actually digging into America's own history, going back to the Alien and Sedition Acts that President John Adams had passed in the 1790s, and a Defense of Secrets Act from 1911 that also specifically dealt with the regulation of government information.
President Wilson, he was behind the Espionage Act, correct? What were his attitudes about free speech? Well, he didn't veto it, obviously, so he had to be behind it.
Wilson was very much in favor of the Espionage Act. He certainly believed that the federal government needed to control the access to information. It also needed to control the dissemination of information that might be critical, whether of the war effort or of the draft. Wilson knew in 1917 that the war was unpopular and that support for it was going to need to be enforced. He wanted the control for that to be in the hands of the federal government, rather than in the hands of, sort of everyday people tarring and feathering some outsider in their own community.
That's right, because in localities, towns, cities, there were groups, private groups, not government groups, private groups of citizens going around to newspapers or whatever saying, shut up or we're coming back here with baseball bats, right?
That absolutely happens. And in fact, it not only does the initial Espionage Act not stop it, it actually leads to even more increases. So in fact, the Espionage Act is amended with a bill called the Sedition Act in May of 1918 that goes even further, right? And in fact, makes it a crime to interfere with the draft or even to do anything that brings the nation into disrepute through disloyal language in one form or another.
I think this context is important. It's also fascinating to just get an idea of what the climate was like in the country that would lead to such a terrible law. You mentioned how World War I was not popular in the United States. Consent and support had to be manufactured. The government hired this fellow by the name of George Creel, Creel. He was a public relations specialist, and he came up with this idea for a committee on public information, which was outright propaganda, right?
It absolutely was. But of course, Americans deliberately changed that term. European powers that were already fighting since 1914 had official propaganda agencies. Creel's brilliant move was to say, Americans don't do that. Americans don't fall for propaganda. Americans consume and critically debate and consider information. And the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, that Creel founded and headed, delivered enormous quantities of government-approved information to the American public. And in some ways, flooding the information marketplace with the government voice did its own work to displace the voice of dissenters, who were also at the same time being suppressed when they expressed contrary views.
These efforts worked, didn't they?
They looked like they worked. Newspapers were shut down.
But as far as getting support for the war effort, too, I mean, it did move the needle, right?
It does. I mean, it sort of shapes the conversation. And in fact, when that's the only voice that you're seeing in the newspaper, on posters at train stations, that's the opinion you're going to believe.
And then when blood starts to be spilled overseas in Europe, people do rally around the flag when our boys are in harm's way.
Yeah.
So the Espionage Act passed in 1917, and almost immediately, its censorship provisions are enforced. We're talking about how this was supposed to be about spying and espionage, but it was used also, or maybe even mostly, to crack down on dissent, using the post office. Why the post office? It doesn't sound like law enforcement when you think of the post office.
You wouldn't think so. The Espionage Act gives authority to the federal government to regulate disloyal speech. But if you think about it, in 1917, where do you go in your community to find the federal government? You go to the post office, right? It is the most widely distributed federal bureaucracy in the country at that time period. And the law, of course, gives authority to the Postmaster General to make the final decisions about whether, for example, a newspaper is loyal or disloyal. And that puts an enormous amount of power in the hands of unelected and in many ways unaccountable government agents.
So who is targeted? Communists, socialists, people on the left mostly?
Overwhelmingly, but not completely. Socialist critiques of the war or of the war effort or of industry were very heavily targeted. But I think the ethnic press, particularly German language press, is in some ways the number one target. There's a concern that the Germans might be using German language newspapers to do propaganda, to convey sort of secret information. So they're target number one. But also groups that we might now see as conservative populist voices, agrarian voices, farmers and others in the countryside are also being targeted. So really sort of anyone who's speaking out against the war effort is under scrutiny at some point.
There was a Southern populist named Tom Watson, and he had a publication called The Jeffersonian, and his publication was shut down, right? And he challenged this in court, and he won on free speech grounds, but then the government came after him again with a different charge. I think I'm getting this right, that he was obstructing the draft.
Yes. And so one of the provisions of the Espionage Act and also of the Selective Service Act that preceded it is that you couldn't do or say or publish anything that would interfere with military recruitment. So speeches against the draft, speeches against military service brought people like Tom Watson, people like Eugene Debs, a socialist activist based mostly in the Midwest, really brought them into federal prosecution. That power is one that government took very seriously, in part because they were concerned that the draft would be impossible to enforce without that kind of heavy hand.
Wow, what a way to get around the First Amendment. Just say, well, you're making people resist the draft, and that'll handicap the war effort, so you're going to help us lose the war.
It becomes so blurry, but at the time people felt, or those defending the Espionage Act, felt that it had to be done.
From David Kennedy's book, Over Here, in the chapter titled The War for the American Mind, he states that Wilson, President Wilson, only feebly opposed the rampages of his Postmaster General. In late 1917, the president gently suggested to Burleson, who is the Postmaster General, that I'm sure you'll agree with me that we must act with the utmost caution and liberality in all of our censorship. Burleson did not agree, nor was he persuaded, and he continued to censor, and Wilson basically gave up trying to convince him to stop. Is that how you see things?
Absolutely. To become Postmaster General in the early 20th century, you kind of had to be a friend of whatever president was coming into power. This was a job where you handed out patronage and jobs left, right, and center. And Burleson was this sort of loudmouth, big-talking Texan who, wasn't in it because he liked stamps and mail. He was in it because he liked to give out jobs to people he liked and to block people he didn't. He was a tough political player. And Burleson takes the Espionage Act and he runs with it. And you're right that Wilson did very little to intervene or weigh in, except in the rare cases where the Espionage Act touched someone that Wilson knew, someone that he had known from his days as a progressive reformer in New Jersey before the war. And every once in a while, a personal appeal could get some attention. But overall, Wilson paid very little attention to what was happening on the home front.
So according to David M. Kennedy, he suppressed one journal for proposing, my gosh, that the war be financed by higher taxes and less borrowing. He also censored others for reprinting Thomas Jefferson's opinion that Ireland should be a republic. I mean, this got crazy. Some people went to jail, right? Went to prison for these offenses.
Yes, probably as many as 2,000, I think, actually.
That is crazy.
served at some point. And the number of prosecutions brought is even greater than that. And we have to kind of think about what we might call the chilling effect, right? So even if you're not prosecuted by the Espionage Act, if you know someone in the next town over who is, that's going to have an impact on your newspaper, whether you write that letter, whether you make that speech. And so, it reaches really the whole country.
The one voice of dissent I always think of first when I think about this period is Eugene V. Debs. Probably the most prominent socialist in American history, arguably. He was a presidential candidate many times. He was arrested and sentenced under the Espionage Act to 10 years in prison. Did he serve the entire sentence?
No, he didn't. He was eventually released. So after the war is over, those who had been convicted under the Espionage Act, many of them were pardoned whether by President Wilson himself or by his Republican successors, Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. But one of the big exceptions is Eugene Debs. Both Republican and Democratic presidents felt that he was a real threat to their power. They resented his uncompromising opposition to them and to the whole capitalist system. And so he actually served a much longer period than almost any other Espionage Act convict.
Socialist movement never really recovered from this.
No, and it also breaks up for its own reasons having to do with the Russian Revolution. But certainly the systems of repression that were developed during the war for Germans and others are very quickly turned to left movements afterward.
And just to remind our listeners of the timeline here, we're talking 1917 when the United States gets into the war, but our soldiers don't arrive in Europe in force until the following year, and World War I ends in November of 1918. Although some would say it never ended. We're still burying it today. So did any actual spies, anyone who actually engaged in espionage, get caught during this period, or was it all petty things like newspapers and movies?
Well, there certainly are people who are caught as spies, prosecuted as such, whether under the Espionage Act or other provisions, but mostly under other provisions, and mostly for events that happened before the Espionage Act is passed. And there are German spies active in the United States, and particularly before April of 1917.
Absolutely. So, spies do exist, yeah.
Yes, there were concerns, but overwhelmingly, the prosecutions of the Espionage Act are against American citizens or other civilians not in league with the German government.
Fortunately, there was a course correction after the war, right? Doesn't Congress repeal the censorship provisions?
So Congress repealed the most extreme provisions, the ones known as the Sedition Act, or allowed them to expire in 1921. But the basic provisions of the Espionage Act remain on the books. And in fact, there was even a debate throughout the 1920s of whether a federal Sedition Act should be continued, in part because state-level laws that criminalized speech or advocacy, particularly advocacy of revolution coming after the years of the Russian Revolution, those state-level laws stayed on the books. And so the same people who had said, look, this should all be done by the federal government, we have this new Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover. They should be in control of this. They were kept pushing throughout the 1920s.
And our modern jurisprudence about free speech, that really comes together in the 60s and the 70s, right? We finally bury these things.
It does. I mean, you see some really important turning points, both at the Supreme Court and elsewhere, where certain voices of civil liberty start to kind of win out the conversation. A sense that first in dissenting opinions, then in majority opinions, that ideas by themselves are not dangerous, right? And that ideas, have to be protected, even as they would say, ideas we dislike. And eventually protections for example, flying certain kinds of flags of labor movements or anarchist socialist movements, flags, publications, one step at a time. But it's really not until the 1960s and 70s that we have a full-on rights revolution.
If you believe speech is violence, well, then pretty much anything anyone says can be prosecuted. So the Espionage Act is back in the news now because of Trump. The law was last modified in 1950. And in the 50s, we do have some successful prosecutions with the law, the Rosenbergs, right? Most of these prosecutions that deal with espionage, they deal with the transfer of information, right?
So yes, a key turning point happens in the 1950s. First, with the 1950 modification of the law, which requires that any citizen who's unauthorized to be in possession of classified material is required to turn it in. And this is a response to the very public case of Alger Hiss, who was in possession of government documents, had microfilmed them, had circulated them, and Congress responds to this. That provision eventually sets up the turn in Espionage Act jurisprudence that turns it from a law about repressing free speech to a law repressing disclosure or whistleblowing, which is fundamentally how it has been applied in the last essentially 50 years.
There was an arrest in 1957, a case I'd never heard of until I started preparing to speak to you, Chris. Colonel John Nickerson, he apparently was, according to historian Sam Leibovich, who also studies this period, the first American to be prosecuted for leaking top-secret national security information to the press. So he didn't give it to the enemy, he gave it to reporters.
Nickerson is a fascinating figure. He is inspired by his passion to win the Cold War. He is an Army colonel. He's working on intermediate ballistic missiles, which are being developed at that time period. And there are two programs under development, one being brought forth by the Army, that's the one he's working on, and one by the Navy. And in 1956, the Secretary of Defense, Charles Wilson, basically makes a decision that, we're going with the Navy plan. And this makes Nickerson angry, partly because it wasn't his plan. Partly he thought that the Army's plan was better. And he also suspected that Wilson had closer ties to the Navy and might have been doing something nefarious or inappropriate in choosing the Navy over the Army. So Nickerson doesn't just write a letter to the Secretary of Defense or the President. He actually takes to the press his research that shows that the Army's missiles are better. And he finds himself under prosecution with the threat of more than 40 years in prison for violating the Espionage Act, which must have been a huge surprise to him.
So in a similar case, a famous case in the 1970s, Daniel Ellsberg, he leaked the Pentagon Papers, which were a factual history, if you will. They're basically a history book about U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but they were so embarrassing to the government, they caused a sensation, and the Pentagon Papers were also leaked to the press, first the New York Times, then the Washington Post. So I guess, Chris, there are a couple of ways of looking at this. On the one hand, you can leak damaging information, classified information to the enemy. And then we've also had many cases where whistleblowers, leakers, hand over classified documents to reporters. And in my mind, those are two different things, although the Obama administration prosecuted leakers or whistleblowers who gave information away to reporters. So is that the main challenge we're facing now today?
In how the Espionage Act is used today, and in fact for the last 50 or 60 years, it has been applied almost exclusively to the prosecution of whistleblowers and public leakers. That is exacerbated by the fact that there is almost incoherence to the provisions of the Espionage Act that remain on the books, because there's no real clear definition of what constitutes, quote, information about national defense.
Yeah.
You could imagine, that covers an awful lot. Just as in 1917, what it means to, quote, interfere with the war effort is equally vague.
Yeah, classified documents. I mean, the government overclassifies. So just because something is classified doesn't necessarily mean it's damaging if it gets out.
Absolutely. And there's information about national security that may itself never be classified. So it is certainly complicated. There are also, sort of provisions within the Espionage Act that require you to surrender government documents if you are in possession of them, right? That 1950 provisions, and to do so, when you are under order to do so. But precisely who has the authority to set that is also requires a little bit of clarification, and that will probably end up in the courts.
Well, I should have gone to law school because I was reading about this, New York Times article. It is not a crime to reveal classified information, but the Espionage Act does criminalize the unauthorized retention or disclosure of information related to national defense that, as you just said, could harm the United States or aid its enemies, however that's defined, right? So Donald Trump is reportedly being investigated for potential Espionage Act violations. When you heard that, what did you think?
Well, as a historian, I was interested, and I think it's just going to keep us in business for a while longer.
Well, I didn't think that Donald Trump was doing any actual espionage.
It once again reveals, right, that the Espionage Act, both as passed at the beginning and as it has been applied in the last few years, really has very little to do with espionage. We don't know precisely why the Department of Justice, at least as, when we're talking here today, we don't know yet why the Justice Department may be pursuing it under the Espionage Act rather than other provisions like the Presidential Records Act. But in any case, it should reveal to the American public that kind of a long overdue discussion about the Espionage Act is necessary.
Are you saying you're not going to jump to a conclusion without all the facts about Trump?
I would like to learn more.
I'm with you.
Historians, of course, always like to wait for the evidence, which might take a generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I may be the only podcaster in America who hasn't come down either way on that one. I just tell people I don't know. And either do you when people discuss this. We don't have all the facts. Anyway, I'll stop pontificating here. Do you think the Espionage Act needs to be reformed?
I do. And I think that knowing its full history is important, and sort of accounting for the fact that it got on the books in a hurry. It has tended to be reformed and expanded during periods of political crisis. Say, for example, in 1950, in the midst of the Cold War, the Korean War, the threat of atomic espionage, and not often with checks and balances put in place. So yes, I do think it needs to be changed. Whether in this current moment, with this very high profile possible investigation underway, is the moment to do that, I don't know. But in my ideal world, there's a bipartisan commission that informed by a lot of history that could take another look at this.
Well, some Republicans are calling to defund the FBI, so maybe we'll get there. Last question. What was the most ridiculous usage of the Espionage Act during World War I? I mean, what was the most absurd example of cracking down on a harmless opinion?
That's a great question. That's like you're inviting historians to have like a best of bar conversation. Yes. But yes, if I had to put my money on this, I think this is a pretty well-known story. At least it certainly has come up a lot lately. In the middle of the war, the emerging film industry in California put together a movie called The Spirit of 76 to kind of whip up American sentiment about everything that they did to found our country and fight off tyranny, overthrow the British Empire. And then it was pointed out that we were allies of the British during World War I. And so stirring up anti-British sentiment would be a violation of the Espionage Act. And in fact, the film was briefly suppressed.
World War I did not remain a popular war for very long, if it was popular at all. The sentiment, the hysteria that the government built up to back the war effort faded quickly, didn't it?
It did. And there was a real sense that the war had led to excesses. And in some ways, we owe a debt to the people who lived through those excesses, because in some ways they gave us the civil liberties that we've enjoyed in the century since. And some of that required institutional structures to be built, like the American Civil Liberties Union, new ideas in courts about all of our First Amendment rights, free speech, religious expression, and more. We have some lessons to learn there, and I think some things to be sure that we continue to defend.
For people today on the right and left who think free speech, well, maybe we shouldn't have so much free speech. We only take it for granted today that the government can't shut down a newspaper because of what happened during this period.
Absolutely.
Chris Capozzola, we thank you for opening a window to a bygone era. He is a historian at MIT and author of Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we have a special guest, the journalist Peter Bergen, one of a handful of Western reporters to have ever interviewed Osama bin Laden. We're going to speak about the future of Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan. Next, when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.